Welcome to the Cryptid Compendium exhibit series, where we review the most authentic, or at least interesting, pieces of evidence to support a cryptid's existence. I'm your host, Remy Militello, and in this episode we will be going over videos that were convincing enough to make it onto the news regarding Bigfoot. We will also be covering a man who is extremely convinced the Canadian government is hiding secrets about Bigfoot, and a woman who claims to have DNA proof the creatures not only exist, but is genetically linked to humans, as well as a special treat for those who stay to the end. For the sake of time and sanity, I have edited out all of the parts of the newscasters har-harring over these videos, because I'm sure we've all had enough of that. But in our first video from 2014, a Virginia man claims to have video evidence of Bigfoot. The video itself is comprised mostly of two pretty blurry frames of what could be a Bigfoot, or it could be a guy in a ghillie suit. It's just too far away to get any detail out of the dark blur. The newscaster on the right does make an excellent point about staying out of the woods, as the man who caught the footage claims to have shot Bigfoot 25 years ago. So I agree, maybe this guy should stick to the beach, but look out for sea serpents when you do. I deem this piece of evidence to be inconclusive. Moving on to number 2. And we have another son of Virginia. This time, a Hickory man caught our beloved furry mountain man, or woman, in 2019. This longtime Bigfoot enthusiast and researcher was finally able to snap up some videos. The man alleges a rock was thrown at him, and then his dog ran off after the rock. But he was able to get what he believes to be 3 different Bigfoots looking at him through the trees. So personally, I do not think this video is more compelling than the last one. Whatever is behind the trees looks pretty big, but once more, it's too dark of a shape to make out any facial features to really help us identify. But I have to say, it fills me with joy listening to this man talk about getting the footage, as he sounds like a kid on Christmas. Unfortunately, this one, too, is just lacking enough detail for me to give it anything other than another inconclusive. The second brief video from this report appears to be nothing but darkness, so there really isn't anything to comment on. Lastly, and sadly, the claims of Bigfoot prints are just too spurious and have proven too easy to fake to be considered worthwhile evidence at this point. Next up, we have another video from 2019. This time, a man from Utah with his own story to tell. Right off the bat, this video is the most compelling so far, without a doubt. This creature is extremely far away, so again, we don't have much detail to speak of, but this time the fact that we can see this thing at all in the distance is pretty compelling. The man who spotted it didn't have any special interest in finding Mr. Foot either. Merely 3 dudes hang out when they saw something weird. I rate this one as pleasantly plausible. They do have to spoil the good mood by quoting a curator from the Natural History Museum of Utah, who then uses appalling logic to rule this video out as evidence of anything. Not only is the figure in the video no Sasquatch, but it's safe to say Sasquatch wouldn't even exist. This assertion is backed up by a plea to likelihood and odds, arguing that the odds of a creature this big never having been spotted by observers and researchers disproves its existence out of hand. You don't need to have a doctorate in natural history to see that this reasoning is circular and flawed. Nobody has ever found it, therefore it must not exist, is just not a sound argument. Especially when using it to discredit evidence that no alternative explanation for what is actually given is provided. He doesn't comment on the video, he just says, Bigfoot can't exist, therefore he doesn't. I respect his skepticism, and I am a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic myself, but this just smacks of ivory tower laziness. I'm an expert. I haven't seen it, and I've explored, like, all of Utah, essentially, so it doesn't exist. It couldn't possibly have been there when I wasn't there, so, and when no one else was there, so it just doesn't exist. Moving along, our next piece of evidence is from 2015, recorded in Tampa Bay, Florida. This time, a picture of presumably a swamp ape was sent into the news when the original taker of the picture declined to comment further. Another outlet he sent this picture to had it examined by the FBI. After examining the metadata, it was found to be a Photoshop. Looking at the picture itself, it certainly has a somewhat shooped quality about it. Also, it's very strange that Bigfoot is just in the perfect spot for a picture completely anything in a dense swamp. Verdicts, it's a hoax. So, I want to put forward a theory to you that Bigfoot is not altogether different from other animals such as tigers or sharks or other apex predators. In that one of them claims a large tract of territory for its domain, being largely solitary until they meet another of their kind to procreate. Granted, primates don't generally exhibit these kinds of behaviors, but big cats don't tend to exhibit social behavior either, and yet lion prides do exist. I'm just saying that something being rare and unusual doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Now, if you're my wife, Caitlin Militello, a self-avowed Bigfoot expert, but to be fair, we all are, would ask where the bones are. And I think this is actually a really fair argument. We haven't found any credible bones for Bigfoot. I don't think we find a lot of bones and are just sort of natural everyday hiking, which is like sort of how most Bigfoot evidence ends up being found. But to be fair, we do have evidence of those other animals, so we don't need to go looking for fox bones. So my wife wanted me to bring this point up, and I think it's a fair one, so I wanted to make sure we covered this while we were discussing skepticism. Our last piece of evidence is from back in 2013. A group of Bigfoot researchers in Texas calling themselves the Sasquatch Genome Project claimed to have found incontrovertible proof of the foot's existence. They spent 5 years and $500,000. So I'll repeat that. $500,000 to come to this conclusion. This includes DNA evidence. However, they never go into any detail whatsoever about this DNA evidence. We do get to see their video evidence, though. And let's be honest, these videos of the creature walking at a distance straight up looks like one of these guys walking around back and forth in a Bigfoot costume. The only interesting piece of evidence is the one where we see close-ups of Bigfoot's face, where he looks a hell of a lot like Chewbacca, as does the footage of him laying down. I can't help but shake the feeling these guys bought a really good Chewbacca costume and then filmed this in the name of getting the truth out about Bigfoot, as we have seen more than one person in the Bigfoot community do this exact same thing and spread a lie in order to help people believe the truth. This isn't how science is done. I cannot stress this enough. Fakes and frauds only make it harder to put forward actual evidence and prove something. Faking Bigfoot's existence by using cow bones or manure from a different animal and putting it forward for genetic testing, like, that does not help anybody. It just wastes your time and the resources of whatever poor lab is doing this. Next up, we have not a piece of evidence, but a man certain that the US, Canadian, and British Columbian governments are hiding the truth, or at least ignoring it. His name is Todd Standing, and he is alleging that in the over a decade plus he has been bringing evidence forward to the Fish and Wildlife Department. They refuse to acknowledge him. They refuse to come out with him in the field and see the proof for themselves. He has taken it to the next level and has started his legal campaign by bringing suit against the British Columbian government for dereliction of duty. So I just have to say, I really admire this guy's tenacity and willingness to stick to his convictions. But man, do I hate these awful But man, do I hate these awful Bigfoot photoshops. They keep scrolling over. I also think his argument against Fish and Wildlife isn't a terrible one. If Sasquatch exists, then it's their responsibility, as are all animals in their jurisdiction. He then regales us with a story of a police officer who was forced to shoo away a Sasquatch twice. And this is clearly a function of Fish and Wildlife. I like this argument. I do. I think it's funny that it is so legal in its nature, which makes sense. It's a lawsuit. And I want to say I haven't read the papers here, so a lot of this is going to be hearsay. But I like this argument. I think it's somewhat compelling. Where this all goes a little sour is where he starts going on about all the evidence he has, including DNA and forensic evidence. Again, no details provided. Instead, leading with video footage. At first, it looks okay. But then we get to see the insanely spliced in Bigfoot face, and his credibility takes a nosedive, in my opinion. He then wraps up the interview by rambling about precedent and taking them to court, and how if they can take it to court, he'll win, but the judge needs to see precedents to get it to trial. None of what he said makes any sense, and seems legally unsound. Also, he ultimately wants them to come out to British Columbia with him for a 3-month ecological survey to prove Sasquatch is real. That is not how the law works, but that's what he wanted. And I wonder how the lawsuit is going, and well, it was nice while the dream lasted. And oof, this hurts. From the article, in a recent decision, British Columbia Supreme Court Justice Kenneth Ball found no reasonable cause for the lawsuit and said the court had no power to compel the province to conduct scientific investigation of its flora or fauna. Yeah, that's just not how the legal system works. You usually can only ask for money or for someone to stop doing something. The judge also dismissed the claim that Mr. Standing's rights were being violated, stating that the province had never placed restrictions on his Bigfoot-related interests. The court told Todd that the non-acknowledgement of the Sasquatch does not in any way prohibit or restrict the plaintiff's ability to express his thoughts, beliefs, and opinions regarding the Sasquatch. So, the court doesn't have the power to compel the kind of survey that he wants. No surprise there. And they aren't infringing on his right to believe in Sasquatch. Again, not very surprising. What I did find strange in this section, not revealing specific locations where Sasquatch sightings occur, is the decision of the plaintiff, and in no way infringes upon his ability to espouse his beliefs regarding Sasquatch existence? To me, that sounds like Todd was holding out on the location of Sasquatch. Perhaps he wanted to take them out there himself? But this certainly casts a very different light on what happened. If he was refusing to tell Fish and Wildlife on locations to investigate and then brought a lawsuit for not going out into the woods with him, that this was really going to be the only result. And it also sounds like he tried to argue that them not coming out there infringes on his freedom of religion. which that's quite creative. This sounds a lot more like the behavior of a serial killer than a scientist, to be honest. And for those of you who are seeking assistance from something like a fish and wildlife, don't do this. If you have sightings or any kind of evidence, don't hide the ball, just give it to them. And if you're going to sue them, I don't know if I would argue that Bigfoot is a religion, but you know, you are free to do that. So I have to say, this last video is a doozy. Dr. Melba Ketchum, a veterinarian and the director of DNA diagnostics, alleges to have incontrovertible DNA evidence that Bigfoot not only exists, but is genetically linked to humans. We also found out Rob Lowe is apparently a big Bigfoot fan. That's essentially the entire thrust of this video, but this came out in 2012. What has happened in the near decade since then? Well, as it turns out, a lot and not that much. So in 2014, it appears that Melba wrote a duology of books called Mystic Forest, Wishes, and Memories. Guess what they're about? This is pulled from a glowing Amazon review. This teen fiction book has an amazing subject. The giant but elusive forest people, recently recognized as Homo sapiens cognatus, a species we share our country and planet with. Going on to say, the novel teaches young people some important lessons: respect for life in its varied forms, the possibility of kinship and relationship with another species, the existence of a closely related species, and much more. There was also this interesting and confusing section. Be aware that earlier versions of the book inadvertently contain some ideas that lighter, finer featured people are more intelligent, civil, and more fit for leadership. Later printings of the first edition have eliminated these elements, which have unintended implications. The author had been drawing on accounts from some of the Native American sources, but they happen to reinforce some embedded racist ideas we tend to have. The last part aside, this book has like all glowing reviews. It appears Melba wrote a self-insert fanfic where she becomes friends and maybe lovers with a Bigfoot. If anybody out there has read these books, please give us your thoughts down in the comments. On a side note, I also discovered while researching these novels that a book called The Quantum Bigfoot exists, and for some reason, that just makes me really happy. But back to Melba with her DNA evidence that the Bigfoot is genetically linked to humans. This is from an NBC News report. The study by Melba S. Ketchum suggests that such cryptids had sex with modern human females that resulted in hairy hominin hybrids. Ketchum said in a statement, the scientific community was rightly skeptical, partly because Ketchum research, which spanned 5 years, had not appeared in any peer-reviewed scientific journals, which isn't good. Well, I think we can safely say that Melba is really enthralled with the idea of human women and Bigfoots getting it on. I won't kink shame, but I will shame her for not getting her findings peer-reviewed in any capacity. That's just how science is done. Everybody takes a peek and cross-checks your findings. Anything less is highly suspect. The study, which used 111 samples of alleged Bigfoot hair, blood, mucus, toenail, bark scraping, saliva, and skin with hair, and subcutaneous tissue attached, were collected by dozens of people from 34 sites around North America. Hairs were compared to reference samples from the common animals including human, dog, cow, horse, deer, elk, moose, fox, bear, coyote, and wolf, and were said not to match any of them. So, that's somewhat interesting. That's a huge sample size for something like this. I've never seen one that big. So, what were their findings? The report concludes, we have extracted, analyzed, and sequenced DNA from over 100 separate samples. Obtained from sources of collection sites throughout North America, hair morphology Hair morphology was not consistent with human or any other wildlife hairs. DNA analysis showed two distinctly different types of results. The mitochondrial DNA was unambiguously human, while the nuclear DNA was shown to harbor more structure and sequence. The data conclusively proves that the Sasquatch exists as an This data conclusively proves that the Sasquatch exists as an extant hominin and a direct maternal descendant of modern humans. So let's break this down a little. She is saying because the hair didn't match any of the animals tested against it, and the hair had both human and unidentified DNA, Bigfoot is then real. So the main issue here is that Melba is clearly assuming her conclusion and filling in the blanks left over by the test. In the best light possible, this test would not prove Bigfoot existed, only that these hairs don't match the animals selected, and there's some connection to humans. Jumping from that sentence to Bigfoots are real and made love with human women is a gigantic leap in logic. But we also have this statement. So what can we make of this? The most likely interpretation is that the samples were contaminated. Whatever the sample originally was, Bigfoot, bear, human, or something else, it's possible that the people who collected and handled the specimens, mostly Bigfoot buffs with little or no forensic evidence gathering training, accidentally introduced their DNA into the sample, which can easily occur with something as innocent as spit, sneezing, or coughing, which is a fair point that is never addressed by Melba in her paper. But most damning of all, and this one is truly a heartbreaker, is the sample collection methodology employed. So you know how I was talking about what a big sample size that was? Well, the reason it's so big is because it was filled with literal garbage. How did the team definitively determine that the samples were from Bigfoot? Well, they didn't. The report details where Bigfoot samples were retrieved, hair found on tree, and hair found on wire fence are typical. In other words, the people collecting the samples didn't see what animals left it. There were possibly weeks or months of time where these things just sat out in the open. But if it seemed suspicious, it might be Bigfoot, and there it is. These are just random hairs collected that nobody can even give an eyewitness account came from a Bigfoot. You could just as easily argue these hairs prove the existence of bear owls. This is nothing. But we can't simply ignore the issue that no scientific journal would touch this article. That raises a huge amount of red flags about the veracity of the study on the face of it, even not going into how it was actually conducted. Ketchum's study had been rejected by other scientific journals. So what about the journal that finally published the study? De Novo Scientific Journal, which I think is just Latin for the New Science Scientific Journal. The journal has no other studies, articles, papers, or reviews. Ketchum's is the only paper the journal has ever published. And no libraries or universities had subscribed to it, and the journal and its website apparently did not exist 3 weeks before the publication of this paper. There is no indication that the study was peer-reviewed by other knowledgeable scientists to assure quality. This is not a known existing journal with any kind of respect, and it doesn't have the stamp of approval of any others either. The journal it did appear in had never published a single paper before this. A quick look at the absolutely hilarious website will show they never published anything after either. So it appears Melba made up a scientific journal because no paper would take hers. And while I respect that gumption, that's tantamount to just fraud. So it's not surprising that no scientist would take her seriously. This is likely the final nail in the coffin for this to have any legitimacy to us as Bigfoot enthusiasts and researchers. As part of this, geneticist Brian Sykes threw down an interesting challenge to the research community for Bigfoot and cryptids at large. I'm challenging and inviting the cryptozoologists to come up with the evidence instead of complaining that science is rejecting what they have to say. And I think that's true. In an interview on Monster Talk podcast, Dr. Todd Distal of the New York University Molecular Anthropology Laboratory dismissed the idea that Bigfoot could be a primate that arose as recently as Ketchum's DNA results claim. If it's a primate that is so similar to us, that's only separated from us from about 15,000 years ago, that's us, he said. Even with people of European extraction, we've got 50,000 years of common ancestry since we left Africa. In other words, there is far more than 15,000 years of genetic diversity among ordinary humans. So the idea that something that's split from our lineage would be as different from us as a Bigfoot is absurd. And there you have it. Science does not bear out that if Bigfoot is connected to us in any shape or form, not saying one way or the other, that connection has to be ancient. Because if we're already at 50,000 years for just human biological diversity, the Bigfoot's got to be far older. And Melba put it at 15,000. That's impossible. Like the doctor says, that would just be a different person. It seems like the Ketchum Bigfoot DNA study, which was supposed to rock the world with its ironclad scientific evidence of Bigfoot, is a complete bust. No other way to say it. And tells us more about junk science than about any mysterious monster. Scientists will not be impressed, but Bigfoot believers, they might be. This Bigfoot hopeful was not. The report is available to the public for $30. If anyone wants to give me $30 to read it and review it, would be more than happy to. I'm sure it would be very entertaining. And there you have it. Melba's claims about DNA evidence are spurious at best, downright deceptive at worst. This collection of random hairs, possibly contaminated in collection, proves absolutely nothing, unfortunately. So sadly, we are going to have to rate this one as not buying it. For those of you who stuck around to the end, I thought I would include this delightful PSA using Bigfoot to advocate for smart social distancing.
Hi, I'm Lon Peterson with SCTV. I'm here live in Central Park in the city of Santa Clara as we've received multiple reports of Bigfoot sightings here at the park. Unfortunately, we've been looking around for over an hour with no luck at all. So apparently the legend lives on.
Hey look, Bigfoot!
Oh my gosh, let's go! Do you see him? Look, he's there. Okay. What? You've seen it here live first on SCTV, Bigfoot adhering to Santa Clara County's public health guidelines. Follow Bigfoot as we continue to practice social distancing to stop the spread of COVID-19. Visit santaclaraca.gov/coronavirus to find out more about COVID-19, free testing dates, vaccination information, and the city's multiple relief programs. Play it safe and stay healthy, Santa Clara.
Well, the hunt for the foot continues. Sadly, I was not very impressed by what I was able to find, but I'm hopeful someday we will get something a little bit more substantive. If I find anything especially compelling, I plan to return and make additional exhibit videos. But for now, we will keep on this new cryptid series by talking about sea serpents. So hit subscribe, click the bell, and leave a comment, and keep an eye out in the coming weeks for more of the Cryptid Compendium. Stay safe, stay spooky, and have a horrifying week. For those of you who have stuck around to the end, I thought I would include this delightful PSA using Bigfoot. I thought I would use...